Everybody, it's Ben with Red Barn. I'm here today to talk about epoxy pours. We're going to be doing some Ecopoxy pouring. Going to go through the basics from forms, the materials to use for your form, the wood itself, some of the prep that you want to do, and then measuring things out and pouring it. First, let's just start out with the form itself. It's super important to have your form completely sealed off. If you can see here on this form, I've got it taped and silicone caulking. The reason you put the taping in is so that you get a good release off of the epoxy. The reason that you're going to want to put in the silicone is so that you don't get any leakage. It's super important to have the silicone in there, just simply so you don't waste a ton of epoxy, because if this isn't sealed, if you don't have your form sealed, it is going to leak out. Guarantee, absolutely going to leak out, because the epoxy finds its way to all the holes and cracks, and you're never going to get this tight enough to keep that sealed in without the silicone. So make sure that you're sealing it with silicone. Any different, like kitchen grade or bathroom grade silicone is going to do the trick. Make sure you give it plenty of time to dry so that you don't get any leakage. The second part of that is the form itself. You're going to do a 3/4 inch melamine board. That's what I use. You tape it off with any type of HVAC tape. As you see here in the video, it's tuck tape, but Tyvek tape also works. You're just going to want to have that on there so that you get that nice pop out when your epoxy is cured. So you're going to make, just a simple box for it to go into. The bottom, the sides, everything is sealed off with your tuck tape and then your silicone. Once that form is ready, then we need to start talking about the wood itself. This particular piece is a nice walnut slab that I prepped. All the edging is cleared. As you see, all the live edge has been cleared of any bark, any debris, anything that's going to get in the way of the adhesion of that epoxy. You want full adhesion, so you don't want to sand this too high of a grit either. 100 really is about as low as you, or as high as you want to go. 100 is as high as you want to go with the sanding, so that you get good adhesion. Also, any areas that have holes or cracks, you're going to want to clean those out. Make sure you get any bark out of those, just because, once again, that's another spot that can create weakness where the epoxy doesn't completely adhere to the wood. So your wood has been prepped. You've cleaned it, it's leveled, it's sanded, so that you don't get all sorts of debris in there. Then it's time to start talking about measurements in volumes of epoxy. What's real nice about Ecopoxy, because the flow cast is a 2-to-1 ratio. On the green side, it shows if you want 9 liters, you're going to do 6 liters of the resin, 3 liters of the hardener, and it kind of measures it for you. All you have to do is figure out what you need, and that's a simple math equation of volume, cubic inches, and then convert it over to cubic inches to liters. So you take your length, width, and thickness, multiply that gives you your cubic inches, and then you just do the equation over to liters, which you can Google that. So this, for instance, this casting is 31 by 31, so 31 inches long. We take the average over here of this gap, which is 4.5 inches by 1.5 inches of thickness. That gives us 235 cubic inches. So once you figure out how much you need, then you can measure it out in your Ecopoxy bucket. So next, let's go ahead and work on measuring out the epoxy into the Ecopoxy bucket, and then we'll mix it up. All right, now it's time to mix up the epoxy. Like I said, the Ecopoxy buckets are real nice. They have the measurements out on them. We're doing the flow cast, so it's a 2-to-1 ratio. We need 9 liters for this particular pour, so we're going to start with the resin. So 6 liters of the resin. 3 liters of the hardener. Make sure you don't get any bad splash when you're doing this. So we're using a 12-liter kit right now, so each of the resin jugs holds 4 liters. So we've got 4 liters in there already. Now 2 more, and we are good for the hardener. Yahtzee. Make sure that you reseal the cap so that it doesn't start curing over time, because that'd be a shame. All right, now 2 liters of the hardener. I'm sorry, 3 liters of the hardener. All right, now you want to mix it for 2 minutes and then add color after that. So let's put her on the floor and use our Festool power mixer and get this mixed up. There it is. All right, so we mixed the epoxy for 2 minutes, and now it's time to put the color in. The reason you want to mix it for a solid 2 minutes before you do the color is so you do get a good solid mix. Now, color time. Today we're going to go with a bluish gray, midnight blue with whale, if you're wanting to replicate this. So a little bit of the pigment, not too much. A little bit goes a long way. And then the midnight metallic. I really want to get the marbling, so I'm going to do a decent amount of that. A little bit more. And then the whale, just to give some darkness and depth. I really like the way they complement each other. Then we'll remix until the color is nice and uniform throughout the epoxy. We are ready to pour, but one thing that's worth mentioning is we let the epoxy sit for at least 20 minutes. The pot time on this Flowcast is 8 hours, so you have enough time to let it sit. And the reason you want to do that is during the mixing process, you do work some air bubbles into the epoxy, so you want to let those rise up. It's going to make it so you don't have to torch this as much or heat gun it as much, whichever method you prefer. But we've got it mixed. It's ready to go. We're going to go ahead and pour this and see how this turns out. All right. Make sure you do a nice, slow, even pour so you don't run over your molds. And you don't push extra bubbles into the epoxy when you pour. And it's totally okay to let it run over. It's not going to hurt anything. Now, I personally like to pour extra just because you are going to get some shrink on big pours. If you're doing a smaller pour, you can be pretty exact with it. You're not going to get a lot of shrink in the epoxy. But as this starts to cure and heats up, you might shrink a little bit on a bigger pour. So I always like to run over just in case. All right, so the epoxy's been poured. It is full coverage over top the entire slab. That's the way I like to do it on big pours. Everybody has a personal preference, but as you notice, even though we let the epoxy settle, there are still bubbles everywhere. So everybody has the method that they like to use. Some people use heat guns. I prefer the propane torch because I like using torches. So we're gonna go ahead and pop these bubbles. One thing that you're going to want to watch out for is any what I would call bleeders, where you have continuous bubbling coming out from a corner or from underneath of the slab if it's not fully clamped down. As you see, I do have it clamped down with blocks that are wrapped in the tape so they're easy to remove. But you want to watch for those bleeders because you're going to have to babysit those so you don't get big potholes, as I call it, in the epoxy. You are going to have some micro bubbling along the edges. One thing to note that I hadn't said earlier was that the wood itself, do not seal the wood. Don't put any type of a sealant onto the wood. Some people put polyurethane. That's been found to cause problems with adhesion. So don't seal the wood. Oils, polys, anything like that is going to cause problems with the epoxy and the adhesion to the wood. It's going to pop, it's going to crack, it's going to let go, and you're going to have problems down the road. So make sure that the wood is raw. You are going to get some micro bubbling. That's totally normal as long as you watch this and you're popping the bubbles as they come up. You do have 3 total days before this cures, 72 hours. 72-hour cure time. You can come back in 24 hours and still be able to pop the bubbles. It's going to be kind of a taffy consistency at 24 hours, but you'll still be able to pop the bubbles and it'll reset itself. Once you get to day 2, 48 hours, no more bubble popping is going to be possible. So what it is at that point is where it is, and you're going to have to sand out any bubbles that have persisted. And if you look here, over here on this line, and right in here, you see I got a couple little bleeders. Most of those bubbles are gone, but I got a bleeder there, I got a bleeder there, and a couple over here in the center. So we're going to want to watch those. If we don't continually pop those, we're going to get big bubble clusters that could cause problems with the final finish. But I do put extra epoxy in, and that's to prevent having what I call potholes, where you get bubbles that sink below the depth the final depth of the piece. So we're going to watch that for a little bit and see how this kind of sets out. Once the epoxy is poured, then the waiting starts. The timeline for the epoxy to cure and for all the bubbles to work their way out is hours upon hours. So while we're sitting here watching this and babysitting this piece, let's talk about some of the things that we haven't touched base on yet, or common questions that I get. You know, a pretty normal question I get is what is the point of the blocks here? The blocks are here for a couple of reasons. Number one, to keep the wood from floating up out of the epoxy. Okay, so the epoxy, it is pretty thin like water, so the wood will float up. It's buoyant, so you got to use the blocks to keep it pushed down so you don't have all the epoxy work underneath. You're going to have some of the epoxy work underneath the piece and work underneath the blocks. So, you know, one of the things that you have to do is to pop the blocks out when it finally does cure. A couple things that I've learned from doing this is it is a learning process. Number one thing to remember is that you are human, you are going to make mistakes. I've made lots of mistakes. I've unfortunately had, silicone seals break where I have, $1,000 of epoxy on the floor and there's no way you can stop it. Be prepared for things like that to happen. This is, it is a challenge, but it's a rewarding challenge if you do everything right to be able to have a piece that looks so great. But be prepared. Make sure that you're following all the steps, but also don't be surprised if something does happen. All right, so we've waited a while. We've had some bubbles pop out. We're going to go ahead and torch those again. Like I said, you can use a heat gun as well. You don't want to hit directly with the torch. You don't want to cook the epoxy. You're just, giving a little rise in temperature to make those bubbles work their way out. And that's the whole point of this. That's why a heat gun works too. But don't sit in one spot too long or you're going to create a chain reaction with the epoxy starting to dry faster than it should. Now, this does have 3 days to cure. So I've prepared a piece already. We've already taken it out of the casing and I've sanded it down, and we're going to show you how to apply finish to that and what the final product looks like after it's been dried and ready to go. All right, so I've shown you how to make your mold, how to prep it, how to prep the wood for the pour, all the mixing, the color, everything that's so fun about the front side of doing epoxy. Now let's talk about the great stuff that happens at the end. Once your epoxy's cured for at least 3 days, sometimes 4, make sure it's 70 degrees in the room that it's in. Once that's cured, you're ready to pop it out of the form, and then you start the sanding. You take the extra epoxy off. I have a charcuterie board here that is almost ready for the oil. Make sure if you're doing a charcuterie board, you're using a food grade oil. If you're doing other stuff, there's lots of different products. Make sure you're not using polyurethane. Epoxy and polyurethane do not mix well. So you're using oils, waxes, something that is approved for epoxy. But what we're going to do here is I have started standing this with 100 grit. I've worked my way up, about to do 1,000 grit with my Festool orbital. These give a real nice, this is a number 3. This is number 3 orbital. I start with a number 5 orbital, work my way up as the grit climbs. This gives me a nice, easy sanding, even. And we're going to take this to 1,000 and then put on the oil. Another thing that's great about the Festool system is the dust collection system. It really sucks almost everything up. You sometimes have a little bit left in there that you got to get with a tack cloth, but for the most part, as you're sanding, it's pulling most of the dust out of there, so you don't have to get too crazy cleaning this. Make sure that when you do clean it, you're not using an alcohol-based cleaner, because that will break down the epoxy. So I have a food safe cutting board oil here. I'm going to go ahead and put that on. I like to hand apply it. It looks really nice. It's fun to do. And make sure you follow the instructions for whatever product you use. This one says shake well. We're going to shake it up. Make sure you put enough on there to really get it. And you see the colors really pop on that epoxy. It's, you know, it starts out kind of a hazy white because of the sanding process, but as you put on the oil, boy, does it come alive. All right, everybody, I'm wrapping up this Ecopoxy Flowcast pour. Really loving how the colors turned out with the midnight blue and the whale and the depth that it's given it. I hope somebody out there was using this as a way to figure out how to do the pour, and I hope the pour turned out great. A couple things that I want to throw out there is everything that I use here today, from the Ecopoxy Flowcast to the wood, the melamine board that I used for the form, everything is available here at Hartville Hardware. They have a great product selection depending on the level of pour you want to do, from a small pour to a big pour to the finishing products, whatever you may need, including the tools. All the Festool tools that I use, I get right here at Hartville Hardware. They have all sorts of selections. So I really hope that you had a great pour. I hope that I was able to answer some questions for you. If you have some questions that I didn't answer, go ahead and comment below. Somebody from Hartville or myself will answer. We'll try and do the best we can to help you through the process. And good luck out there, and God bless.